So, hello. We are on air now, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of our LIBER webinar series. And the webinar, as you know, is organized by the Steering Committee Research Infrastructures, in particular the Research Data Management Working Group. And today we focus on what to keep in terms of research data, and we have Neil Beagrie with us. Many of you will know him. He's an expert in digital curation and data management, and we will hear him talk about a report which came out about a year ago, was commissioned by Jisc, and he will tell us about the findings and recommendations. And there's of course opportunity for you all to ask questions. So the webinar is recorded, and you can use the chat for your questions. And after the presentation, we have Rob Grimm, who will collect some questions, and we have also prepared some additional ones. So please go ahead, put your questions, comments into the chat. And we start slowly because people are still joining. This is a webinar which was very popular. The highest demand so far, over 270 people registered. And please notify your colleagues if they have not been able to register. We will open up the webinar through a link which will be posted on Twitter by the LIBER office shortly, and then likely everyone can join, because it's always more people registering than actually turning up. So I hand over to Neil now, and please take.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those introductions, and welcome everyone to this webinar on research data, what to keep. I'm going to be speaking in English throughout, and I'm conscious from the list of attendees that it's not going to be the first language of many of you. So I will try to speak slowly and clearly, but if you have any problems in hearing me, please just put a message in the chat, and I'm sure somebody will draw it to my attention. As you heard earlier, this webinar is being recorded, so the slides and the recording will be available via LIBER. And also the report, what to keep, has been published and is freely available via Jisc. So if you do have things that you want to follow up, you'll be able to see that report, and we've given you a URL for the download later on in the slides. So to begin, the aims of the webinar, I hope you as attendees will learn about existing practice and guidance for appraisal and review for research data and related materials, about some of the generic disciplinary and subdisciplinary differences in defining research data, for example, practice-based research in the arts and humanities and how that differs, about research integrity and data sharing as strategic drivers for research data management, about differences in the levels of curation and considerations of benefits and cost, and about the what to keep report recommendations, which were largely, if you like, policy related. So in terms of scope, as I mentioned earlier, this is based on a UK Jisc-funded what to keep study. So although it is based on UK practice and interviews, I think a lot of the findings will be relevant to other countries in Europe. So within the report, we had a definition of research which was taken from the UK Research Excellence Framework and the guidance there on submissions. And that definition includes arts practice, things like performance, scholarship, the intellectual infrastructure of disciplines such as dictionaries or research databases. So it's intended to cover, if you like, not the full practice of research across the arts and humanities, as well as the sciences and social sciences. We also used a definition of research data from the Concordat on Open Research Data developed by the UK Research Councils, and that was the evidence that underpins the answer to the research question. And the study I need to put that back on again. Bear with me, sorry. Study really uses that recommendation, which covers covers some other things like software, metadata and documentation, and physical samples within its discussion. So in terms of what to keep, the study ran from May 2018 to February 2019. So the report and its recommendations and findings are just over 12 months old and should still be current. The project aims were to provide new insights that will be useful to researchers, institutions, funders, publishers and Jisc on what research data to keep and why, the current position and suggestions for improvement. In terms of methodology, it involved desk research, case studies, a wide range of interviews, analysis of that material, and then a stakeholder workshop involving about 30 participants from research funders and repositories in institutions and across domains. The work aimed to cover the main academic research areas in the UK, a range of disciplinary maturity in terms of policy and practice for what to keep, ranging from those who are perhaps just starting out in terms of developing disciplinary norms through to those who've been sharing data quite widely over a number of decades now. Also a range of outputs, potentially including not only data, but software and documentation required for its future use, and also differing requirements for the location or where data would be deposited, such as domain, that's international and national disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories, or instrument data repositories for things like large-scale synchrotrons, and different reasons for what to keep. Key part of the previous the desk research, which was to look at previous work. It considered the impact of FAIR initiatives, that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Also looking at impact of research integrity and reproducibility and initiatives like the transparency and openness promotion or top guidelines for journals. It looked at the detailed acquisition guidelines in many domain repositories, and also previous influential guidance documents, including the Natural Environment Research Council Data Value Checklist, the Digital Curation Centre and Australian National Data Service Guide to how to appraise and select research data for curation. And it looked in detail at 6 guidance documents. These range from 12 to 14 pages in length. Perhaps some general discussion of criteria for appraisal and selection, through to influential 2 to 3 page checklists to be used for that appraisal process, like the NERC data checklist, through down to even 1 page guidance, like selecting what to keep and what to bin, as an institutional guidance from the University of Cambridge and the Prepare project. So there's a great variation in terms of length and perhaps in focus and type of material in that guidance. And the What to Keep report has, I think, one very important table in the appendices, which is table 3. And that looks at the data appraisal and selection criteria, which were discussed by the interviewees in the What to Keep report, and mapping them to the other 4 other major checklists, including the NERC checklist, DCC 5 steps, Bristol University checklist, and the Prepare checklist from the University of Cambridge. And I think that this is only an extract I've put for you in the presentation here, but I think it's a really important tool. And if you're looking to develop a checklist yourselves for your own institution, I point you to this particular part of the report as a very good source of material and comparison to develop your own checklist. There are 7 case studies in the report. First of those is for a funder covering all disciplines, and that's from the UK Research and Innovation, which is the umbrella organisation for the UK Research Councils. There's a case study covering a domain repository in humanities and archaeology. That's the Archaeology Data Service. Again, a domain repository for the social sciences, which is the UK Data Service. And both those case studies give you a good idea of the sort of domain-specific criteria which can apply and considerations which apply for those domains. It's also a case study for an instrument repository, and that's based on the Science and Technology Facilities Council and some of the major national facilities that they run, such as synchrotrons. There is a case study from University Research Data Service based in and coordinated through a university library service. That's at the University of Bath, which again will be of interest, I think, to many of you which are coming from a university background for this webinar. And there is a case study for research practice-based arts and humanities, the Practice Research Advisory Group, which is focusing on an area of the arts and humanities which is very nascent in terms of its research data management practice. Finally, there's a case study from a publisher in Science, Technology and Medicine, STM. So it's the International Association of STM Publishers. I think gives a very important perspective from journals and publishers on research data management. So to go into more detail on one of those case studies, and that's some of the funders' comments on the optimal data research to keep. And I felt this was a very good overview, which I've just summarized and cut down a little bit here for you about what they saw as the optimal research data to keep. And the criteria mentioned were data which support primary research findings, which are necessary to reproduce or query those findings which have been published. Data that is of obvious long-term value, for example, longitudinal studies. Data which is subject to legal requirements, and that can be things like clinical trials, or indeed the criteria and requirements in research grants. It also points out that some data with short-term value for one purpose or set of users can also have long-term value for other purposes or users. So it's not just the perspective of the original creator of the data which needs to be borne in mind. There are issues around the quality of the data. Obviously, researchers there are experiments which, for various reasons, can go wrong. The data is misleading. They would want to rerun the experiments and wouldn't necessarily want to keep that initial data. And there's also the key criteria around data which is suitable for reuse and which can be shared and will be of value for future research. I think it's also interesting that there's discussion in that case study of where some questions remain around instrumentation data, whether you keep the raw data or the processed data, and some of the issues, or both, and some of the issues and criteria around how you would determine that, about outputs from models and simulations, about the process of serendipity and the need to be thinking about the needs of future research which may not have been anticipated, and also in other areas. So regarding supplementary data materials, the interviewee suggested we should keep the metadata and documentation surrounding that research data, some software and algorithms and codes which support data reproduction or interpretation for the results of that research, and indeed physical materials like reagents or biological samples which may be related to the research, even if they're outside the scope of the What to Keep study. Another one of the case studies in more detail, which I thought was perhaps interesting to share with you, was that for the researcher practice-based arts and humanities. And it was stressed there that they're starting from a position where almost nothing in terms of research data is available. It was mentioned that the term research data is anathema to many colleagues working in these areas. They would not recognize the term and are more likely to use colloquial expressions such as stuff. That may be a bit of an exaggeration. I'm sure there's a range of different terms that could be used there, but I think the key thing is to recognize if you're coming as a curator to this area, that there are domains and areas where the term research data will not necessarily be recognized. And you need to be careful about the language which is used to engage with those researchers. Another problem which was emphasized is that researchers in this domain see their projects as open-ended. Without the imperative to complete research projects for publication, arts practitioners often see their research output as something which is there and will continue to evolve and continue to be a focus of future work. So these types of, if you like, semi-active or dynamic types of research data, I think are very distinct from those which, if you like, are closed or suitable for immediate archiving. And again, you need to bear that in mind as an issue. So some of the key findings from the report were that the What to Keep study interviewees identified some 33 different factors or elements to consider in appraisal and selection of what to keep, and there were some 17 different reasons for why data may be kept. And the suggested factors or element for what to keep from interviewees can be mapped to existing checklists, as I've shown you earlier from the appendices in the report. And researchers' role in what to keep in appraisal and selection within universities is often critical. And that selection is guided by curators in the universities. But because I think the curators are often have to be generalists, the initial focus on who does the selection and appraisal is often pushed towards researchers. And there's a very different emphasis in the domain repositories, which can be staffed by domain experts and have that particular domain focus, but often the selection decisions are being taken by the curators, assisted by researchers. So again, that's something important to remember when you're looking at the checklists to see where perhaps the guidance and the checklists are coming from in terms of how they've been developed. And finally, but by no means least, it's essential to consider not only what to keep, but for how long to keep it, where to keep it, and increasingly how to keep it, plus who funds those tasks. So in terms of researchers' perceptions, I think, of research data, I think one of the most useful things I encountered in doing the desk research came from Carol Goebel in a presentation that she gave in Open Science on how to serve the needs of the researcher. And she presented this as a staged open access spiral. And she's suggesting that you start in the center of this spiral with the researcher, and as you go outwards and begin to widen out the audience for that research data to policy makers and the public more widely, that the number of assets which are relevant reduces, the richness of the metadata and documentation needed increases, And the reach of sharing increases and the burden of work increases to achieve that. So she's arguing for staged access, which reflects those differences. I think that's an important perspective to bear in mind from the researchers and the work that's involved for them in making research data accessible and available. And it does mirror, I think, hold on, come back. Sorry, that leapt ahead slightly. That's a lot. Some of the discussion which has been there amongst curators and discussed, I think, over a number of years now about levels of curation. It's an idea which first emerges with the US National Science Board in 2005, which tried to define 3 different levels of long-lived data collections, starting with research data collections, primarily for use by the researcher and the research teams and their collaborators, through to resource community data collections, and up to reference data collections, which were seen to be of widest use and potential of interdisciplinary use as well. There are also some levels of curation within the core trust seal requirements, which were published in June 2018, although these only focus primarily really on the access requirements. So it suggests 4 levels of curation performed, ranging from A through to D, with these differing levels of activity suggested for each of them. And it's quite hard to point to examples of where levels of curation have been applied in repositories. But there is, I think, a very good example within the What to Keep case studies, and particularly the domain repository for the social sciences and the UK data service. And that now has a 2-tier, if you like, levels of curation applied to its services. Policy and appraisal help to determine the appropriate service solutions offered by the UK data service, whether it will be reshare or the UK data service main catalogue. And data collections selected for long-term curation, these data will have long-term secondary analysis potential and have been assigned to the UK data service main catalogue and the level of curation which applies to that. Secondly, the data collections selected for short-term management, typically up to 10 years, these collections will not initially be retained for long-term preservation, but will be retained for that initial period of 10 years before review, and that review may be moved up to category 1, i.e. part of the long-term collections after that review. They will be backed up, i.e. there's bit level preservation only for the reshare material. So it's, if you like, a lower level of curation initially, and it's suggested within the case study as well that there will be, if you like, a considerable difference in cost between those 2 levels of curation. I believe a very similar sort of 2-tier curation now is also applied by the Social Science Data Archive in the Netherlands as well as the UK. So again, I think that's quite an interesting case study for you to look at. So some of the recommendations of the report in this area were as follows. First of all, to consider what is transferable in terms of effective practice in what to keep between disciplines, and to support adoption of generic effective practice through things like checklists for appraisal and selection of research data. To support workshops to bring communities together to evolve disciplinary norms for what to keep for their research data where these are currently absent or evolving. And the Prague work group and the case study for that in the report are a good example of that. To seek to harmonise funder requirements for research data where relevant, for example, where the data type is the same but the funders and the requirements differ. To investigate the relative costs and benefits of different curation levels, different levels of storage or appraisal for what to keep, so that we can inform future curation decisions. and then to apply the FAIR principles and the Open Research Data Concordat principles as appropriate to kept data to help improve reuse and also research integrity and reproducibility of the data. So in terms of the current UK position for research data management in the report as of February 2019, the report found that the current state is highly varied. In a few rare cases where there's an end-to-end process and all outputs are in a single repository, the current state in which research data is kept is categorically known. In the majority of cases, it is known when deposited in a central repository in the organisation, but largely unknown when deposited elsewhere. It is currently often difficult to establish from sources such as research publications or grant databases which research projects have generated research data, and therefore what the total population may be, or where the data is. And the broad picture from the interviews is not contradicted by the desk research and a number of surveys at specific points in time in recent years at local, national, or international level. And interviewees expressed different views on the potential utility of research management systems, data management plans, to help improve the picture of current state of research data. They were all felt to have some degrees of strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps some combination of them would be needed to improve our understanding of where research data is and how much of it is being produced. Other recommendations were to enhance data discoverability and to enable the unambiguous identification of what has been kept. To require data access statements. These are also referred sometimes to as data availability statements in published research articles, and to encourage the adoption of the transparency and openness promotion top guidelines created by journals, funders, and societies to align scientific ideals with publication practices. In terms of some of the shortfalls and suggestions mentioned in the report, so interviewees identified some 15 different areas where there are current shortfalls and made some 26 different suggestions for improvements, which you can find in detail in the report. Just to summarize and pull some of those out here, around growing data volumes as an issue, interviewees felt there would be a need for more selection, potentially for more funding, or tiered storage, perhaps differential storage in terms of cost, costing research data management more accurately, and improving discovery and access. In terms of researchers not following grant conditions for sharing, there's felt to be a need to improve incentives for more publisher and funder collaboration, for more audit of research data management. Some mentioned the need for more sanctions, for more advocacy to researchers, more training, more automation of the deposit workflow, and one-to-one guidance to assist with research data management. I think a very useful observation was also made by publishers interviewed around maybe funders and publishers should collaborate more. They could encourage the right behaviours if they worked as a team at only 2 points in the research lifecycle where researchers are incentivised: when they get the grant and then when they get published. Costs were also seen as high, and there was a need to show a better demonstration of value. Developing guidance around costing, better budgeting, and help in those efforts. So in terms of the recommendations from the report in these areas, I've covered 2 of them already, but then we included improve incentives for data sharing, to increase publisher and funder collaborations around research data, and to improve communication on what research data management costs can be funded and by whom. In terms of future value for research data management and how to assess that, I think the key source is obviously to point you to the What to Keep report. The aim of the report is to be a succinct, concise and hopefully accessible report on the current state of what to keep in selection and appraisal of research data. And it is a free report available for you to download from the URL shown on this slide. I would also point you to the cost-benefit advocacy toolkit developed for the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives. And that has a series, I think, of very valuable tools for thinking about future costs and benefits of research data, particularly the 3 fact sheets on benefits, costs, and return on investment. And this toolkit was developed specifically, I think, for individual researchers, curators or small curatorial teams, so that the guidance and advice could be synthesized and absorbed very rapidly. So it's a very good source, I think, of going if you want to see a concise synthesis of some of the research and findings over the last 10 years in terms of benefits of research data or the costs associated with them, then I would point you to this as a source of guidance. And again, it's free to download from the URL shown in this slide. So I hope that's been helpful as an overview of what's in the report and examples for you and for discussion. I'm left quite a lot of time in this attendee session for any questions and for discussion with you. But if we do overrun, I'm very happy also to take any questions offline. You can email them to me at this email address. So at that point, I think I will hand back to Birgit and to Rob and start to take any questions and start to discuss the points which have come out from the attendee chat.
Thanks, Neil, for these presentations. We have for this presentation we have a number of questions, a few in the chat. One is on the the collaboration between publishers and funders. What could you comment on that? How you see this and how this could work?
I think it's partly around promotion of the top guidelines. I think that's a critical thing. Getting things like data access statements into journals, knowing where the data has been produced and deposited, I think is quite critical. So it's part of that incentivizing, talking to editorial boards, developing domain-specific guidance and practice.
Right. And then there's another question. I read this aloud from the chat. Do we mix things up when we talk about publishing data for reuse and archiving for reproducibility at the same time? Question mark. Might be 2 very different scenarios for the researchers, as CSV file is good for publishing data and Excel might be the best for reproducibility.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's one of the things that the report suggests is that we need to be very careful to distinguish between reuse and reproducibility as drivers for the research. And if you look at the case study for an instrument domain, instrument repository, it makes the point that there are cases where you may have the same research project will generate data which will be very different and have very different potential value either for reuse or for reproducibility. It gives an example of the raw data from an produced off an instrument being important in terms of reproducibility of research, and the process data being perhaps the most important for reuse by other researchers.
Right. And coming back to the former issue, are there any examples of collaboration already between publishers and funders on the point you make in the report?
Yes, there are examples given in the case studies, I think, which I can point people to.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, I'm struggling to think of one immediately, but there's a number listed there, and I think that would be perhaps helpful for people to go and look at. But I think there's always more in these areas that can be done. And I think the point about researchers being incentivized when they get the grant and when they come to publish in terms of their practice is also quite a critical one. I think a very well made point.
Right, yes. Then a more generic question. So this study details the motivation and criteria for what to keep and why to keep data sets and resources relevant to research. But what is the role of libraries in all this?
I think libraries have had a long tradition within universities of selection for long-term value and reuse. That may be very generic, but increasingly they're becoming more involved in research data management within their institutions and helping to guide that. It's not a sole responsibility of the library. Often they do it in collaboration with other relevant departments and with researchers, and indeed some of the within institutions, often there's multiple repositories and distributed curation of research data. But I see the role of libraries being really in that expertise around the selection of data and being able to provide advice potentially and coordination across the university.
Are libraries seen as a sort of manifest stakeholder in the UK in this diverse field of actors relating to selecting, appraisal, and preservation of research data?
Very definitely. I think it's something which has been pushed now for over a decade. I think a number of people have been encouraging libraries to be more active in this space. And many of them are already doing so.
Okay, thanks. And what is the role of policies in all of this? So,
sorry, I missed that, Rob. Can you repeat it again?
Yeah. So, what is the role of policies? Or Birgit, if you're listening, this question on your side, maybe you can we can switch to.
I was just wondering, you know, as you said, I mean, the journal plays a role at time of publishing, the funder at the time of the proposal, and what's the role of, I mean, institutional policies, or is it disciplinary policies which are more important? Do they have any clout, I mean, in terms of changing practices, or is it just a reference point, but basically ignored when it comes to the practical side? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I suppose my initial thought is difficult to generalize. I think it can, the current experience perhaps tends to be that it is very hard to persuade perhaps and have that degree of influence. It's important to have those institutional policies in place, but it's one of many policies. I think that's a point that can be made even about when it's in a research grant. There will be perhaps anywhere, certainly it's not unusual to see 40 or 50 clauses in a research grant, and very different range of things which need to be considered by the institution and researcher and applied. So it's one amongst many requirements, and it can be difficult, I think, to get the leverage to push research data management to the top of those list of requirements. Excuse me. Just take a gulp of water. I think there have been some drivers in the UK, particularly the one of the research councils, EPSRC, had a set of guidelines which put an obligation on the institution rather than researcher in terms of research data management. And that had quite a strong driver at one point for adoption of research data management policies in the UK. I think Jisc has also been very influential in supporting a number of institutions in developing policies. So I think it's been quite mixed across the board.
Yeah, maybe a institutional policy can at least be a safeguard of certain basic principles. I mean, in terms of, I mean, and coming back to this link between publishers and, I mean, more collaboration between publishers and funders. I mean, do you see any risk in this as well? I mean, they of course offer more services now, and is it something? Yeah.
I think it really depends, I suppose, on really the general editorial board, partly. I think and also about whether the journal is making that data openly available. If it's open research data, I think who provides that service, if it's still open, I think that's I think maybe something which I find less worrying, but I can understand why you're asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays they might likely say it's good to have access first, and then, I mean, the openness is included in the package, but it's also, yeah, if you are the service provider, then you.
I'm effectively neutral in terms of the service provider, I think, is what I'm suggesting there. It's the outcome I think I would be interested in, but I think it's a collaboration. I think it will, even publishers do not see themselves as providing everything, and there's a lot which institutions already do and will continue to do.
Let's turn to some more questions.
Yeah. Neil, there is a number of questions come in that relate to what has done with the report since it was published, and it looks like people are interested in a sort of to repackage the report in terms of a handout and a checklist that could be published, which could be sort of concrete, direct of use for libraries and the attendees to work with. Have you thought about that?
Yes, I suppose it's the report is a report as it's been produced, but the potential to do that clearly is there, and I think as a report, it's there with Jisc copyrights and rights over it. I think if LIBER, for example, were to approach Jisc and ask whether there's an interest in working on the report to produce an output like that, I think that would be a very good development, certainly something that I would support and be very happy to see.
Mm-hmm.
So the potential outcome from this webinar, if you were interested in taking up that suggestion, I think that would be fine.
Okay, thanks. And then another question, so what key insight does the study provide on the relation between what to keep and cost and benefits in terms of return on investments, etc. on the other side?
I suppose the key thing for me is perhaps to think more about the levels of curation and how it might be applied. It's the reason why one of the recommendations there was to look perhaps more at the costs and benefits of that and how it to try and get some more definition of it, because it was something that was mentioned by the interviewees that there's a substantial difference in costs without that being quantified. And I think we need to know what perhaps the how big a difference in cost it makes in order to be able to make some of the decisions around that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the benefits, I think, again, the key thing for me was perhaps we have to be careful to recognize that not all research data is the same, that it has varying value for reuse, and we perhaps need to be proportionate in terms of our expectations of researchers and services in, in thinking about those different types of research data and value. So we try and invest scarce resources as best we can.
Thanks. Another question relates more to the infrastructure. So do we need, for example, more sort of data registries at the institutional level? For example, labeled with levels of curation? Or how do you see the further development of the infrastructure for curation, preservation, archiving, etc.? I think the UK Data Archive changed the name to UKDS, Data Service. So archive seems a term that's no longer en vogue, so to say. How is this field transformed, libraries included, with large volumes of data and yeah, still so many issues?
It's extremely disparate, and I think I suppose we have obviously a wide range of suggestions from the interviewees themselves across different domains for areas of improvement of the infrastructure, and those are detailed in the appendices of the report.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things which would be valuable is trying to a whole series of things. First of all, we need a better idea of what research data has been produced and where it's been deposited. And I think that's both from an institutional perspective, but more broadly as well. So things like the requirement to say in a research article where the associated research data has been deposited and the terms under which it could be accessed, I think is quite key. I think the repository environment continues to evolve,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very different between disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to recognize that some disciplines which are now very advanced in terms of research data sharing and practice, perhaps 2 to 3 decades ago when they first started looking at this question, were at a very preliminary basis with a great deal of resistance to data sharing. So I think that can evolve over time as well.
Right.
I'm looking for things coming in as questions. I'm afraid they just flash before me, so I'll rely on you and Rob to select out other questions.
Yeah, there are more questions coming in now, which is good. Let me see. That sparks up different ideas, new ideas, and ideas for additional products, like the checklist and the decision tree based on the report, which is all good, I think. Scrolling through. Let's see what I have on my list. So what about the other disciplines? For example, the life sciences and the STEM disciplines. How does this report serve these disciplines? More the science, technology, medicine, life sciences.
They're still covered. I think they're within the scope of the report and are discussed within the report in the case study. I think some of the issues there vary slightly from discipline to discipline. So perhaps in some of the more technology-focused and engineering side of things, where some of the research tends to be more developed with commercial partners. There's more around commercial confidentiality and development of the data. So those sort of issues tend to come in rather more. In terms of the medical sciences and indeed some of the social sciences, a lot of the research data may relate to individuals or to sensitive data. There are special rules requirements for that and for how the data can be handled and shared. So I think there's a very diverse range of things that apply across the like the whole of the piece. If you look right across research data, and those domain-specific criteria and concerns can also be very important.
Right, but for example, if libraries are about on the verge of starting or developing new services for, let's say, curation and preservation services, what would you recommend that they either start with a sort of a generic service, sort of general curation, or should it be a combination immediately with a generic service and a deep curation services in at least one discipline? How to go about when you're on the verge of developing these type of services?
I think maybe the critical thing is to start off with outreach to the researchers and departments within the institution around their needs, and probably developing, I think, advice and guidance. It can be around doctoral training programs, perhaps as well, when researchers are just starting out, and perhaps easiest to influence in terms of practice. I think there are a number of good examples of that, certainly in the UK, and I think elsewhere internationally. To look at some of the good practice which is coming out of things like the RDA working groups, which they point to. I think there's a lot which people can look at and take examples of good practice from.
Yeah. And you being an international expert, to what extent is this report representative also for outside the UK, let's say Europe and US, as far as you know?
I think it should be representative for Europe and the US. I'm very conscious when I say Europe. Europe is also very diverse. But I think it will be helpful, and certainly in terms of the depth research, we draw on examples from outside the UK. And in terms of the reports I pointed to from CESTA, the cost-benefit toolkit, again, that's very much drawing on international practice. So I think there's good material there for people to work from.
Right, and that would also be useful for other disciplines, the work that has been done for, within CESTA.
Yes, I think although it's some of the examples are specifically tailored to the social sciences, I think a lot of the advice is generic, and indeed it draws examples from other non-social science disciplines as well.
Yeah, I have a last question. I think that's on training. So what do you recommend? Where should activities be stepped up in this area?
I found within the UK some of the most interesting examples seem to me to have been some of the training programs aimed at doctoral research programs here in the UK. So where libraries have got involved in those. But I think although it's covered in the report, it's less my direct area of expertise. I'm conscious that there are other people within the RDA working groups and so on who could probably give you, I think, much better examples than perhaps I can at this stage.
Right. Thanks, Neil. Thanks from all of us, from Birgit and the whole working group to work with us on this webinar. I'll now give back to Birgit for maybe a final question or just to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you, Rob, for helping us, guiding us through the questions, and of course, thank you to our audience for your comments. And I have seen there was a lively discussion among people. So yeah, thank you for joining today, and spread the word when the recording comes out. And if you have any further questions, as Neil said, he's happy to answer also when you write him a message. So have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.